What do you mean often, but?
I mean what I say.
Ooh.
You know.
So you're leaving. I should interview you, but Dick already
That's
did.
already, yeah, that role has already been filled. So I've known you a long time. I think everybody knows that you are the guy who ran AOL and got America online, literally. I mean, and then transitioned over to the web. But now you're doing something different. You're doing this thing called Rise of the Rest, which I personally find fascinating. I think it ties into some of the other themes that have been talked about here with the displacement of workers or the issue of, you know, inequality, income inequality. There's lots of wealth and lots of jobs in Silicon Valley, not so much in some other places. Talk about it. What is it?
Sure. Well, first of all, it is great to be here, and thank you for asking me, having been one of your first interviewees in the first conference to be your last interviewee. I'm delighted to be here, honored to be here, and congratulations to you and Kara on what's been obviously a great event and a great kind of track record over really nearly 2 decades. And before I answer the Rise of the Rest question, you know, just hearing some of the discussions over the last couple of days, it is a reminder of how far we've come. In that first wave of the internet, when we got started in 1985, only 3% of people were online, and they were online 1 hour a week. And we spent a decade trying to explain to people why the internet mattered and they should care about it. And of course, now it's a central part of everyday life. So that whole journey of trying to get America online, make the internet kind of central, it's great to see the progress that has been made and the opportunities, particularly in this third wave around education and healthcare and food and agriculture, a bunch of sectors that haven't really changed that much, but will. But in terms of the Rise of the Rest, it's a big opportunity, and I think it's increasingly a necessity. That right now, most of the venture capital, 75% last year, goes to 3 states: California, New York, Massachusetts. 75%. So 47 states, fight over 25%. If you look at this last election, and part of the reason, Donald Trump is President Trump, is a sense out there a lot of people feel left out and left behind. If you look at the states that he won versus Hillary Clinton won, the states that she won, 85% of venture capital went to. The states he won, 30 states in aggregate, 15% of venture capital went to. So this idea of people feeling kind of left out and left behind, it's because they kind of have been left out and left behind. If we're funding innovative, disruptive entrepreneurs in a few places that are, in some cases, destroying jobs in other places, but not at least partially offsetting that by funding entrepreneurs in those places, you're going to have more and more of this divide, more and more of this chasm, and it's going to impact our country in unhelpful ways. So that is one point. But there's 2 other points. That's more dealing with a potential problem. There's 2 other reasons to, I think, focus on the Rise of the Rest that is more around kind of seizing an opportunity. One is, in this third wave, some of the sectors I mentioned, I think partnerships are more important. Domain expertise is more important. It's not just about the software. It's not just about dropping an app in an app store. If you want to really revolutionize health, you kind of have to work with doctors. You kind of have to work with hospitals. You kind of have to work with health plans. You kind of have to work with the government because of the regulations associated with that. And having domain expertise, which was not that important in the second wave, is going to become more important. Most of the 75% of the Fortune 500 companies and many of the leaders in healthcare are in the middle of the country. So being closer to them will become more important, and ecosystems are starting to build around some of those cities that are quite interesting. We could talk about some of the cities and some of the sectors that are going to be part of this Rise to the Rest. And finally, just from investors, there's obviously a lot of investors in the room. We have Revolution is invested in a lot of different companies. There's a valuation arbitrage, since all the investors are, not all, but most investors are focusing on entrepreneurs they can drive to, not entrepreneurs they fly to. The valuations in Silicon Valley tend to be higher. The valuations in Rise of the Rest cities tend to be lower. And there's that arbitrage. But when the companies are successful, Chewy just acquired for $3 billion, one of the largest e-commerce exits. They happen to be in Fort Lauderdale. It's really hard for them to raise capital. The early rounds were priced at a lower valuation. ExactTarget also acquired for $3 billion by Salesforce in Indianapolis. Really hard to get going. But once they broke through, whether you go public or get sold, it gets fully valued. So there's this arbitrage from investors. So part of it is, I think the right thing to do, leveling the playing field so everybody everywhere really does have a shot at the American dream, but it's also going to be more important to do in the third wave when you shift from it just being about software and apps to really being about systems integration and partnerships and policy and some other aspects. And it's a great opportunity for investors, to capitalize on this arbitrage. So that's the reason the rise of the rest is so important.
And how are you're encouraging this rise of the rest by doing a bus tour?
Well, it's a bunch
that you've
of
been doing
things.
for a couple of years now, right?
Yeah, we started 3 years ago in Detroit, which it's worth remembering that 75 years ago, Detroit was sort of Silicon Valley. It was the most innovative city in the country. 75 years ago, by the way, Silicon Valley was fruit orchards.
Yeah.
There was nothing. And so these things tend to kind of rise and fall. So we started in Detroit, then we went to Pittsburgh, kind of powered the whole industrial revolution. And because of Carnegie Mellon, there's a lot of interesting things happening there. Google has a big force there. Uber, a lot of their driverless car operations are there. Then we went to Nashville, which is a great city around health tech, and Cincinnati because of P&G, a lot of things around consumer products. So that was our first tour 3 years ago. Now we've done 26 cities, 6,000 miles, and it's things like Atlanta and New Orleans and Richmond and Madison and Minneapolis and Phoenix and Albuquerque and all kinds of different cities. Each have their own story. And what we're trying to do when we're there is create more of this network effect that is so powerful in Silicon Valley, where people really are kind of connected in pretty important ways. The entrepreneurs with the big companies, with the universities, with the mayors, with the kind of create that network effect and get people kind of celebrating entrepreneurship, investing in entrepreneurs, mentoring entrepreneurs, being customers of entrepreneurs, partnering with entrepreneurs in their region, but also shine a spotlight on what's happening in these places to attract more media attention and attract more investor attention. And the hope is, and we're starting to see a little bit of signs of this, that hope that it'll be a little easier for entrepreneurs in these rise of the rest cities to start or scale their companies, which is not to say that Silicon Valley won't continue to be super strong. It will continue to be the leader of the pack. There's all kinds of network effects there in terms of talent and capital and fearlessness and so forth that will continue. But we have to take some of those ideas, some of that secret sauce to other parts of the country to create a more evenly dispersed innovation economy, so more people do feel kind of part of the future, don't feel left behind, and you're creating jobs and hope and really opportunity in all across the country, not just on the coast.
So you've used this term, the third wave, a couple of times. I can't decide if you're plugging your book of the same name.
Yes, I am plugging the book. The
actually a
paperback
concept.
just came out 2 weeks ago, if you'd like to buy it.
I think you send it to me for free.
I do. You're on our special list.
But what is it? What do you mean by the third wave?
It goes back to some of the original. When we, as I said, when we got started, the first wave of the internet was just getting everybody online and building the software and the servers, the on-ramps, if you will, educating people. I mean, again,
and you did that in Virginia.
Yeah, outside. And the first wave was regionally
not in Silicon
dispersed.
Valley.
Very interesting point. The first wave of the internet, when we went from essentially in the mid 80s, nobody knowing about it or caring about it, and actually in the mid 80s, it was illegal for consumers or businesses to connect to the internet.
Yeah,
It was
because
still
it was a
restricted
military.
Educational institutions. You're on a university, you could use it. Government agencies, you could use it, but consumers or businesses couldn't use it until the Telecom Act passed in 1992. So that was the first wave, is getting everybody online. That was regionally distributed. We happened to be in the DC area. Hayes, the major modem company, happened to be in Atlanta. Dell was in Austin. Microsoft started actually in Albuquerque, then moved to Seattle. IBM was based in Armonk, New York, but their PC operations were based in Boca Raton, Florida. So some of the key players in that first wave of the internet that helped stand up the internet were all over the country. It was the second wave, when it became just about software, that things really centralized, particularly in Silicon Valley. I think the third wave will distribute again because of the sectors that are up for grabs and some of the dynamics around domain expertise and partnerships that will become more important in the third wave than it was in the second wave.
So you have this acronym you're using, or this list of things. I think it's called Restart,
right.
And that's in your new edition of your book. I'm not trying to sell this book, really.
Come on.
But what do you mean by Restart?
It was a reflection. When the book came out, the hardback, about a year ago, I got a lot of feedback, and so made a bunch of changes.
It was printed on paper?
printed on paper, but also available digitally. This thing
Really?
called Kindle. Have you heard of the Kindle? But also post the election, kind of reflecting on this, I think it was a little bit of a wake-up call for the country, and a lot of people were surprised. And so it was sort of an agenda around things that I think are going to be important if we're going to remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. We need to reform the way Washington works with startups. And
That's the R.
That's the R. We need to figure out ways to essentially rethink our education system. Encourage more creativity. Basically, teach things to do the things that machines can't do. Increase more focus on entrepreneurship, things like that. We need to encourage big companies to source, products and services from small companies, particularly in these rise of the rest cities. We need to figure out what the right investment incentives are as this whole tax reform debate heats up over the next year. How do we make sure we have the right incentives to invest in the startups that are going to create the jobs? There's very interesting data on, and we're all close to this because we're focused on our particular company. But if you take a step back, that essentially over the last 3 decades, all job creation, all net job creation in the country has come from startups. Not from small businesses, not from big businesses. The small businesses, the Main Street restaurants, dry cleaners, very important in aggregate, do account for a lot of jobs, but they tend to churn. A restaurant goes out of business, a new restaurant kind of moves in its place. So there's not a lot of net jobs. Same with big companies, the Fortune 500. Some are rising, some are falling, but as a sector, it's kind of neutral. So the place to focus if you want to create jobs is around these young high-growth startups. So what are the incentives around capital gains, for example? There's a legislation that was introduced last year called the Investing in Opportunity Act, bipartisan with Cory Booker and Tim Scott, that would create some capital gains incentives to invest in these rise of the rest cities. So there's things to do around taxes, immigration got talked about yesterday. It's critically important that we take steps to win what is now a global battle for talent. So things like the startup visa are very important. So I think I'm optimistic that we can continue to lead as a country and be innovative, entrepreneurial, but I think there is a real risk that we kind of lose our edge, lose our way. And I remind people who particularly down the street from you and I in DC that it is worth remembering that 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. It was just an idea, and frankly, a pretty fragile idea. The reason now we're the leader of the free world is because we have the leading economy, and that wasn't an accident. That was the work of entrepreneurs first in the
nuclear
agriculture.
weapons are part of it.
Well, there's some. Now you're bringing in your State Department, cred. But we led the way in the agricultural revolution. We led the way in the industrial revolution. We led the way in the digital revolution. That's why I went from this tiny little startup nation to the leader of the free world. Well, you know what? Everybody's figured that out. That's sort of the secret sauce that's powered the American story. And they're trying to figure out how do they attract capital? How do they attract talent? How do they invest more in basic research? So just as we've seen in the last half century or so, the globalization of finance, capital spreading globally, the globalization of manufacturing and some of the implications of that. Now we're seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship. So we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to make sure we continue to lead. I don't believe that's going to happen if we're only investing in a few people in a few places. And beyond the rise of the rest, this regional entrepreneurship, the 75% going to 3 states, there are other data points here that are troubling. Last year, 90% of venture capital went to men, just 10% to women. Last year, 1%, less than 1%, went to African Americans. So it does matter where you live, what you look like, who you know, what school you went to, what networks you're part of. That is a big determinant in terms of success. So how do you make sure everybody who has an idea has an opportunity to take that idea and turn it into a business that can create a job. So I think it's critically important that we not get complacent. I mentioned Detroit earlier. The positive is 75 years ago, it was Silicon Valley. The negative is in the last 50 years, Detroit lost 60% of its population and went bankrupt. Yeah. It's complicated, but at the core, it lost its entrepreneurial mojo. Now it's fighting its way back. We backed a company in Detroit called Shinola. It's doing really well. A lot of things. Dan Gilbert, an entrepreneur, is doing a bunch of interesting things. The mayor is doing a bunch of interesting things. So I was just there a couple of weeks ago. There's a real sense of hope and possibility back, particularly in the downtown Detroit area. But it lost its way. Yeah. It went from the leader to the laggard. And we need to make sure we don't lose our way as a country. And that's only going to happen, in my opinion, if we, while continuing to celebrate Silicon Valley, I know most folks here are from Silicon Valley. This is nothing negative about Silicon Valley, but while we continue to do that, how do we also kind of spread the love, spread the attention, spread the capital to these other places? And there are some encouraging signs in some of these cities I visited where the brain drain that's happened in many of these cities over the past several decades is slowing. People are graduating now from Carnegie Mellon, or some are staying in Pittsburgh, from Arizona State, some are staying in Phoenix. So you're seeing a little bit of a slowing of the brain drain, and you're starting to see the very beginnings of a boomerang of talent. A guy who just joined Revolution a couple of months ago, J.D. Vance, wrote the book Hillbilly Elegy. Some of you may have read it. It's a huge bestseller, sold 1 million copies over the last year.
More copies than your book?
Oh, way more copies than my book. I'm a little mad about that. But the J.D. basically was a venture capitalist working for Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley, and a couple of months ago decided to, kind of pull up his roots there and move back home to Ohio to be part of the Rise of Rest, and he's helping us lead the way in terms of this next evolution of the Rise of Rest. I'm hearing many of those stories around the country, and obviously talent is critically important, and capital follows talent. So I think there is an opportunity for this. I know there's an opportunity for this kind of Rise of the Rest to accelerate. Again, some of the stories in some of these cities, it's remarkable that I mentioned some of the things around Pittsburgh, Nashville, because of their history around healthcare. There's a lot of interesting things happening. The most successful health IT company in the country is Epic Systems in Madison, Wisconsin. They really are the leader in electronic medical records. Baltimore, because of Under Armour being based there and doing a lot of things in health tech. Johns Hopkins being based there, great innovation there. St. Louis becomes Monsanto's headquartered there. They have a couple thousand engineers, understand farming, understand ag tech. A lot of interesting things are happening there. New Orleans, because they had to reinvent their school system post-Katrina, a lot of things in ed tech are happening there. So stuff is happening. It's just most people, even at this conference, yesterday I was talking to people, like, really? Like there's like real startups in some of these places. And just this week, two final examples, Chicago, we invested in a company called Uptake that CNBC said was the number 5 disruptive company in the country. Started 3 years ago, has nearly 1,000 employees, including nearly 100 data scientists 3 years later. Just this week, a company called Outcome Health in Chicago raised capital at a $5 billion valuation. So this is happening. We're just trying to educate people, and the bus tour is part of it, talking about it's part of it, writing the book is part of it. How do we get more people paying attention to the entrepreneurs in these other places, backing them so that they can be successful, and in the process also, as I mentioned, create great investment returns for investors and create jobs in these communities.
I have to interrupt you. I've been doing it a long time, but I let you talk a lot, and it was fascinating. But there's something huge happening in the country. You alluded to it a minute ago, which is we have an inward-looking nationalist president and administration. I mean, he's very open about it. He ran on that. It's not a secret. And he thinks he can fight globalization by sort of ignoring it and ignoring international agreements. He also has a view of business that's, there's nothing illegitimate about the real estate development industry, but it's a different sort of thing. Do you talk to anybody in the Trump White House about this stuff, or do you have an opinion about whether they're good for the Rise of the Rest thing or not? Because I haven't heard them talk about any of this except bring back the coal mining jobs. Which is a completely different thing than saying go to West Virginia, where there were coal mining jobs, and let's move West Virginia into the path of these tech-oriented or data-oriented startups with venture capital, kind of thing you've talked about. I don't hear any of that from most people. I just hear let's bring back the jobs from the 19th century or the early 20th century. So what's going on?
I think that's fair. I think it's unfortunate. Hopefully it will change. But I think the focus of the President Trump and his team seems to be turning back the clock as opposed to kind of moving forward. I do believe once they focus on it and fully understand the issues, that they'll be supportive of the Rise of the Rest, because that is part of the reason why he got elected. How do you get more capital? I think he will be supportive as part of this tax reform of things like the Investing in Opportunity Act, but it has not really gotten on the wavelength.
Have you tried? Have you talked to them?
We've talked to him, yes, and I've not talked directly to the president since he became president. I do know him from previous iterations. I did write an op-ed in the Washington Post a month before the election supporting Hillary Clinton, which is the only time I've moved from being nonpartisan independent to taking a political view, because I was quite concerned about some of his rhetoric around immigration, quite concerned with the lack of specificity around his tech policies. So the fact that I came out in support of her probably doesn't make me the first guy to get invited to a state dinner. But I have had some conversations with some of the folks on his team. I think they're an awareness of both the challenge but also the opportunity. So I'm optimistic, even though some of the things that they're doing are continue to be troubling, including what apparently he'll announce around the Paris Accords this afternoon, if that's the direction he goes in. I think there's reason to be concerned and troubled. But on the issue of the rise to rest and supporting the creation and scaling of more startups in more parts of the country, and trying to deal with this dynamic where a lot of people feel left out, left behind, I think they will end up being supportive, and I would expect some of that would get baked into this tax reform discussion over the coming months.
I'm less optimistic than you, but we'll see.
Well, see, entrepreneurs are always optimistic.
I know. I've always been
They're always
less optimistic
skeptical
than
and
you.
cynical. So that's.
Yeah.
But soon you'll be not a journalist anymore.
Yeah, I know.
You can join me in being optimistic.
Okay. There's been many, I told some stories last night, about some people I've had a lot of talks with. He's one of these guys. We've spent a lot of time talking over the years. I can't let you go or go to questions from the audience without asking you just one thing that's not about the rise of the rest and the restart stuff and all of that, which is, so 15 years ago you came here. You were very, I have to say, you were very gutsy, because you had just gone through the AOL Time Warner merger kind of debacle thing, and you came and you talked about it, and it was impressive, I have to say.
So I have to talk about it again. I'll be like post-traumatic stress.
No, we're not going to do that. But what I do want you to just reflect on for a minute is, it's 15 years. What has surprised you, though? Could you have imagined Twitter, Facebook, all this stuff going on the internet? Some of the roots of some of that were in AOL. You used to have those chat rooms and all that. But just the fact that it's in so much of our lives, every minute, all day, every age group, everywhere, not just here, but all over the world. Is any of that do you ever sit back and say it's amazing?
Yes and no. No, I do sit back and say it's amazing. At the same time, when I was, and even the book, the title of The Third Wave, I actually borrowed from Alvin Toffler, who wrote a book in 1980 called The Third Wave. I was senior in college. I read that book, and he talked about essentially the internet future.
Borrowed it by using the same title?
Stole it, but thankfully Alvin, before he passed away, sadly recently, kind of read it and provided a blurb, and we've gotten to be kind of friends over the years. But for me, that was a really catalyzing moment, because he was talking about this future, and that was, again, 1980, so what, 37 years ago, something like that. And so even when we got started with AOL, as you know, because of our mission statement on the wall, which at the time when we only had tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, that someday this would be more valuable than the television or other kind of technologies, and more pervasive. Most people looked at us like, well, what are you talking about? And it was hard to raise capital in those early days. And I should say our story together goes back now 25 years, when Walt wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal when we were still struggling and still pretty early. I think we had maybe 200,000 customers, and Prodigy, backed by IBM and Sears, with $1 billion, and CompuServe with Microsoft coming and other things. He basically wrote a column, basically put America Online on the map and AOL on the map, and said, this is easier to use, more useful, more fun, more affordable service. So I always believed in the idea of the internet, even though we had some dark days where it didn't look like we'd survive. I always believed that community, social media would be the core. As you know, that was the heart and soul of what we were trying to do with chat rooms and instant messaging and other things. We really believed people was the killer app of the internet. We called it community, now it's called social, but it's essentially the same idea. So Facebook and Twitter, things like that, don't completely surprise me, but the ubiquity of it and how it's now starting to integrate into other industries, and that will, as I said, accelerate in the third wave, and how we went from that early days where nobody cared about it and to now you can't really live without it, and the pervasiveness of that, not just in this country, but globally, has surprised me.
Okay. Questions? Over here.
Hey, Steve Lutherloaf, Vice President of Public Policy for Yelp. If you go back almost 20 years, or next year is the anniversary of DOJ versus Microsoft, a case that you were involved in. You talk to folks today.
A little bit.
Yeah, you talk to folks today on either side of that issue, and though the narrative in Silicon Valley, I think, by a lot of folks my age, is that this is, an example of the government coming in too little, too late, and it's sort of remembered as a stalemate that didn't really have an effect on things. If you talk to people on either side of that issue from 20 years ago, many say that DOJ versus Microsoft had the effect of sort of putting Microsoft in a straitjacket, oxygenating the markets, but for that type of enforcement action, there wouldn't have been a Google, because Microsoft could have very easily used IE to strangle Google in the crib. So I guess my first question is sort of, do you buy that frame? And secondly, going back to Taplin's presentation earlier today, we see a lot of concentration with these big platforms. Do you see a connection between sort of that concentration, absence of antitrust enforcement, and a reduction in innovation and investment? And do you think we're kind of at one of these inflection points where we need some renewed antitrust scrutiny of these big tech platforms?
It's a great question. First of all, as it relates to Microsoft, I do think it slowed some of their efforts. They were a little bit more careful. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say they were in a straitjacket, because they're still pretty aggressive. But I think they were a little bit more careful about some of their moves, and I think that was important. And the other, going back to these early days of the internet, the other government decision, other than the Telecom Act legalizing access to the internet, which is kind of a big deal, that was pivotal but not fully appreciated, is when Judge Green, now 3 decades ago, broke up Ma Bell. AT&T was a dominant monopoly phone company. They broke it into regional Bell operating companies that then led to the funding of hundreds of companies and billions and billions of dollars that basically resulted in the cost of communications dropping precipitous. When we started AOL, it was $10 an hour to be connected. That's why people are only on. Well, you always bitched about a lot of stuff. So how do you figure out ways? And so competition was unleashed in telecommunications, and it became this arms race, and huge investments were made that drove down the cost of access, drove up the accessibility, and first in narrowband, then in broadband. So this role of policy is critically important, and it's going to be important again. And you said this yesterday when Dick was interviewing you. The role of government, and again, I know there's a lot of people just hate government, and like government just stay out of the way, and the regulations are stupid, and they just slow us down, and obviously much of that is true. But you cannot argue, in my opinion, that government not going to be involved when the internet becomes essential as it has become, and when the sectors that are up for grabs, like healthcare, of course there are going to be some regulations around drug safety. When we think about new transportation systems, of course there's going to be some regulations about drones in the sky and driverless cars on the road. When we talk about food, of course there's going to be some rules of the road around kind of food safety. So we are moving from that second wave software app economy to this third wave where the role of government is going to become more important. And the only way we're going to get the right answer is if we have people in this room understanding that, respecting that, appreciating that, and engaging on these issues, so we kind of strike the right balance, and whether it be net neutrality or some of the issues you're talking about with concentration are dealt with in the right way. The only thing, I think their government will need to step in, as you said last night. At the same time, I am reminded that competition, if unleashed, does change the game. There was a cover story of Fortune magazine now probably 20 years ago with a picture of me and a picture of Bill Gates, and the headline was something like, "Who will own the internet or control the internet?" or something like that. The answer, none of the above. That new entrants, Google and Facebook and a rejuvenated Apple, because back then they were struggling and barely alive, and Amazon, which was pretty tiny back then, and that if you enable that competition, you level the playing field so everybody has a shot, things happen, and so I think that is creating the marketplace conditions for innovation to flourish everywhere, not just in a few places, as I mentioned, is I think the most important way to do it. But we all have to engage and understand the importance of policy, not have our head in the sand, not have this kind of hyper-libertarian, just go away view, because that's not going to get us to the right answer. Who's that at the microphone there?
Hello.
Is that Rockstar there?
Yeah,
with the
it is.
Rockstar glasses?
This is a woman who's made some money writing about.
She made a
writing
career
books.
writing books on AOL.
Yeah.
And that's how you discovered her, and then now she's like,
Jeez.
God, whatever.
That is, you and AOL are responsible for Swisher.
And I'm deeply apologetic to all of you for that.
All right. Are
One of
we
my
done?
great regrets of mine.
Are we done with the man crosstalk? Are we done? Okay.
Apparently,
Evidently.
Ms.
So
Swisher.
I never want to miss an opportunity to heckle you, Steve Case, because you deserve it in its entirety. And the only thing we've
Can you
agreed
turn
on.
off her microphone, please? We're on
I
stage
bought
here.
this microphone, as Ronald Reagan said. And I don't agree on almost anything you have to say most of the time, except that we both love Walt Mossberg. But one of the things I think is important we've tried to do here is create substantive discussions around things, whether you agree or not or disagree. So I'd love to know, Steve, from you, because we've talked a lot, you've been on the podcast talking about the rest and other things. What are like 3 substantive things people can do? And that's beyond taking a tour of the Midwest and meeting the quaint people of Kentucky, which I think
Don't
is a
even
little
call
bit.
them the quaint people of Kentucky.
No, I
That's
don't.
the
I don't. That's the
arrogance
whole
of
point.
you
I
Silicon
agree.
Valley types
I agree.
that led to Donald Trump.
You know what?
Ms. Swisher?
I listen. I would like the quaint people of Kentucky to come to the Castro. I'll show them the Naked Man and all the things we do.
All
there.
right, now
I'm happy-
really turn off her
Yeah,
mic.
exactly. I think we should do both things. But give me I don't like those trips. I think they're it feels like arrogant. So what are the 3 things? Give me 3 substantive things people can do besides, this idea of visiting and understanding. Like, what are 3 substantive things? That's what I would like to
Well, first of all, I disagree with you on the visit. I think, and Lorraine said this last night, you do get a sense of what's happening
Proximity.
talking to people and actually seeing things firsthand, not reading about it or guessing what people might be thinking. So, thank you. So, I think the first one, even though you might disagree with it, is get in the game, understand what's happening. Pick a few cities that maybe you're from as one of the. I mean, most of you who happen to be in Silicon Valley are not from Silicon Valley. Maybe you should.
I
go
know
home
where she's from, and it's one of those places.
and spend more time there, understand what's happening there. Number 1. Number 2 is figure out how you can be helpful there. How maybe you can be a mentor, maybe you could be an investor, maybe you could be a customer, maybe you could be a partner, maybe you know somebody who could be really helpful to a company there. So engage, be part of that network, and obviously you can do that remotely through crowdfunding and other things. It gives you the ability to do that in a way that's much more important. And 3 is tell their stories. In next year, invite a bunch of the entrepreneurs from these rise of the rest cities to be on the stage and talk about what's happening there, showcase what's
All
happening
right, we'll
there.
do that. We did actually do a series in Recode on Innovation Nation of cities that are
And
not
that was
part
terrific.
Of,
And
yeah.
I do
was years
more
ago.
more of that kind of thing. So, and again, it's important not to view this just through the context of it's something we should do because there's a problem out there. And there's this disconnect out there, and just people feeling disenfranchised and disconnected out there.
Calm them
And if we
down.
don't do that, we're going to, Silicon Valley will kind of become more and more the next bad guy, kind of like Wall Street. It's sort of. I'm not saying do it just for those defensive reasons or those do-gooder reasons. I'm saying do it because they're great entrepreneurs building great companies there, and they're great investment opportunities there. So that's a reason to do it, and the valuations are lower there. So there's going to be, people are going to be surprised by the opportunity in those places. So those are some, just engaging and trying to better understand what's happening there. If you have the ability to invest, invest. Even if you don't have the ability to invest, try to figure out some way to connect, some way to mentor, some way to partner with some of those rise to the rest companies.
Great.
Last question.
Steve Patrick Ward.
Ward.
Yeah, 104 West Partners. So I live in one of the rise of the rest cities. I live in Denver. I've lived there for 15 years, having spent 8 or more years in Silicon Valley. And Denver's a great city. It's the most popular city in the country. More people are moving there than any place else. Wonderful quality of life, et cetera. You started a company there, Exclusive Resorts, spawned another company in Inspirato. They've got hundreds of employees. Wonderful. I saw a stat on the slide that said there was something like $297 million in venture capital invested in Denver. That's like 5, 7 Series A companies in the Valley.
Right.
Right? So how do you get capital there? So Wahini Uvara just wrote a story this week in Wired, a harrowing story about a guy trying to raise capital in Denver. And it's extremely hard. He had to go to South Dakota. You're nodding your head, so I think you read the story. How do you get capital? How do you get venture capitalists to stop wanting to sleep in their own beds and get on a plane instead of a car, and get on a plane instead of a car, as you said? How do you specifically do that thing? Because it seems to me there that the capital is the real linchpin.
It's not just about the money, but it's the money, the capital aspect's very, very important. So first of all, I say when we started AOL, none of our capital came from DC. There were no venture capitalists in DC at the time. We got it from Chicago and Boston and Toronto and San Francisco and so forth. So I saw that firsthand. Now it's not just Revolution, other firms there. There's much more capital there. But I kind of lived through the journey. Number one is make sure crowdfunding works. The Congress passed something called the Jobs Act 5 years ago that legalized the use of internet to raise money, updating securities laws that had previously been passed in 1933, so they hadn't changed in 80 years, pre-television, pre-internet, the securities laws were the same. But the SEC took 4 years to write rules. There are 800 pages, they're onerous, so it's still difficult for companies to use that. The crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo for projects, when you're pre-buying a product or something, are flourishing, have created thousands of companies, billions of dollars of capital, but we still have work to do on the equity, debt, crowdfunding side to make sure while you keep the bad things from happening, you're also enabling good things to happen. Crowdfunding, number one. Number two is educating investors, which is part of the reason I'm here, about the opportunities there, so they do start paying attention. They do start following what's happening in these cities. They do start understanding that some of the sector expertise, whether it be ag tech or fintech or what have you, isn't necessarily all going to be in Silicon Valley or New York or Boston, but in different parts of the country. And three is to unleash what's now a growing kind of wave of these micro VC regional funds. There's now a couple dozen, soon to be a couple hundred funds, are $20, $30, $40 million that are making so seed and some parts of the kind of being parts of syndicates for Series A investments, which are critically important to have people on the ground in those cities to provide that initial capital. And then when they start scaling, investors from the coast can kind of come into it. So you got to make sure crowdfunding works. You got to make sure you're educating investors about the opportunities there. Again, not the obligation, but the opportunities just to generate better returns because of the valuation arbitrage, and figuring out a way to create a network of these regional micro VC funds and make it easier for institutions to back them. And there's a bunch of different ideas that are being kicked around there. I think that will kind of unleash the capital that is necessary. A good example in Denver is what's happening with Foundry and Boulder. Started really small, now they've started to expand, but there need to be more foundries in Denver and more foundries in other rise or rest cities.
Yeah, they don't invest that much in Denver. And I also think one other thing that's worth considering is, and this is specific to our region, these companies rarely get beyond 75, 100 people, $50, $70 million in revenue, and they get bought up. And so, and what happens is somebody will come in, or Google will come in, Twitter will come in and buy GNIP. They'll come in, they'll buy GNIP, there'll be 75 employees there, they'll whittle that down to 20. The 55 go out, pollinate, and they start other stuff. But there's never a place where you're getting 250, 300,000 person companies that really start to pollinate.
I agree. So a couple ideas there. One is there are some exceptions to that. And I mentioned Under Armour in Baltimore as a good example. It's thousands of employees now, and it's really started to transform Baltimore. Part of what Dan Gilbert's doing in Detroit is because of the success of Quicken Loans. Thousands of employees moved from the suburbs downtown, bought a bunch of buildings downtown, invested in a bunch of startups downtown. Suddenly the downtown area is starting to flourish. But also the model, as you all know, of M&A is shifted a lot from the model where if Microsoft bought your company 20 years ago, you had to move to Seattle, and now it's much more, we're buying you because there's something interesting happening there. How do we keep that team engaged? How do we keep the momentum building? So when Salesforce bought ExactTarget, they had less than 1,000 employees. Now they have nearly 2,000 employees. And while Mark is building the largest building in San Francisco, the Salesforce Tower, he's also building the largest building in Indianapolis, a Salesforce Tower there. So there are examples of how this is now starting to spread. And as people see in these cities, there's opportunity. They start moving back back, this boomerang effect. As you say, there's some successes that spawn other companies. You create that momentum, then there's more capital, and some of the people start investing in the next generation of companies, and more people pay attention to what's happening there, which then accelerates the talent, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You hit that kind of network effect, increasing return. I think that's what will happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But rather than just sit on the sidelines wondering, how do we engage? And it goes back to the original point about the internet. To me, my passion about this is the same passion I had with the internet. That was about leveling the playing field in terms of access to information, to education. Remember, back then, there were very few ways to get information. If you kind of had to go to a school or had to go to a library to get information. How do you level that playing field in terms of information? Now it's just leveling the playing field in terms of opportunity, so that you really give people that shot, and this idea that their ideas, creativity are broadly distributed. Opportunity is not, and some of that relates to capital. So how do we all do a better job of making sure the people with those ideas can start in these places and can scale in these places and can stay in these places and can have this transformative effect in their cities, which I think will result in a more connected country that with fewer of these kind of have-not divides, and also will hedge what I think is a pretty significant risk of Silicon Valley emerging as the new bad guy in terms of the popular kind of perception of it, and it'll have all kinds of different implications. But at the core, it's a great opportunity. So I'm doing it because I believe in it, I'm passionate about it, I want to, but I'm also doing it because I think we'll make money as investors investing in these entrepreneurs in these cities. So join us.
It's good we couldn't tell the passion, by the way.
Thank you, Steve.